welcome to The Explainer. We're jumping right into one of the most fascinating character studies from ancient history, pulled straight from the texts of Samuel and the Acts of the Apostles. We're talking about a ruler who held absolute, terrifying military power, yet somehow managed to execute one of the most profound acts of grace recorded in antiquity. It's really a story of unparalleled success paired with radical kindness. We're going to explore that core tension between being a ruthless conqueror and a compassionate caretaker.
Okay, let's dive into this. Take a look at this quote. "Is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" This is just absolutely astonishing when you consider the historical context. Think about it. You've got King David, newly established on the throne, asking if anyone is left from the family of his predecessor, Saul. In the ancient world, sure, a new king would definitely ask this question, but usually it was to track down the survivors and, well, execute them to secure his own claim to the throne. But David, he's asking so he can show kindness. To really get why he does this, we have to rewind and look at the journey that brought him to this seat of power.
Tracing David's incredible rise, we start with, the young shepherd boy. For 40 days, Goliath the Philistine defied the armies of Israel until David stepped up and defeated him. But that massive success, it actually brought down the paranoid wrath of King Saul. While David was literally running for his life, he hid in a field for 3 days just to test the waters on Saul's murderous anger. And during that terrifying time, it was Saul's own son, Jonathan, who protected David. They made this profound, lifelong covenant of friendship. Fast forward through the timeline, after Saul and Jonathan tragically die in battle, David's rise culminates in his reign, 7 years and 6 months over Judah and Hebron, and then a massive 33 years reigning over all Israel and Judah and Jerusalem.
Which brings us to the era of conquest. Because once David's throne in Jerusalem was totally secure, he didn't just sit back and relax. He initiated a massive and, frankly, completely brutal consolidation of power. We're entering an era of sheer military conquest that took a fledgling nation and transformed it into a dominant regional empire.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer, overwhelming scale of his dominance across literally every border. The text tells us David subdued the Philistines entirely, taking the stronghold of Metheg-Ammah. He defeated the Moabites so thoroughly that he actually measured the captives with a line, casting them to the ground to determine who would live as servants. When he marched against the Syrians of Zobah, he defeated King Hadadezer, capturing all his chariots and horsemen. And down south, he placed military garrisons throughout all of Edom. Literally everywhere he turned, he conquered.
And to truly grasp the bloody reality of this ancient warfare, just look at this number: 22,000. When the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, the text tells us David slew 22,000 of their men in a single conflict. That is an unimaginable amount of casualties. He was a warlord operating at the absolute peak of ancient military dominance. No one could stand against him. Which brings us to a really critical question. When you are a conqueror with the blood of tens of thousands on your hands, and you finally secured absolute power, what do you do with the surviving family of the king who preceded you, especially a king like Saul, who literally hunted you for years?
Well, the ancient world had a very clear answer for this. Normally, the standard operating procedure was simple: eliminate the rival bloodline. You wipe them out entirely so no one can ever challenge your throne. But instead, look at what David actually chose to do. He decided to restore their ancestral land and invite them to dinner. I mean, this is a staggering subversion of what you'd expect from absolute, unchecked power. Remembering that deep covenant he made with Jonathan while hiding in the fields decades prior, David actively starts a search. He summons Ziba, a servant of Saul's house, and demands to know if there is anyone left of Saul's house to whom he can show the kindness of God. And Ziba drops a bombshell. He informs the king that Jonathan does in fact have one surviving son. His name is Mephibosheth, but his story is incredibly tragic. The text reveals that he was lame in both of his feet. When he was just 5 years old, the terrifying news came out of Jezreel that his father, Jonathan, and grandfather, Saul, were dead. In the frantic panic to escape the incoming regime change, his nurse picked him up to flee, but as she made haste, he fell and became permanently crippled. Just imagine the sheer terror he must have felt. For years, he's living in hiding, completely vulnerable. And now, out of nowhere, the most powerful, bloody warlord in the region finds out he exists and summons him to the palace. When Mephibosheth arrives, he just collapses on his face before David. He's in absolute reverence, and you have to imagine, trembling fear.
He says to the king, "What is thy servant that thou shouldest look upon such a dead dog as I am?" He views himself as utterly worthless, a dead dog standing before a king who could literally have him executed with a single wave of his hand. He fully expects to die. And this brilliantly illustrates the radical nature of David's kindness, because he doesn't just pardon him, he systematically restores him. First, he immediately calms the terror by telling him simply, "Fear not." Then he restores all the ancestral family land of Saul back to him. Knowing Mephibosheth is physically unable to work the fields himself, David appoints Ziba and his servants to farm the land, ensuring the family has ongoing food and wealth. And then the crowning jewel of this entire act of grace. He invites Mephibosheth to eat at the king's table continually. He essentially treats him as one of his own sons.
It's just an incredible contrast. Really think about it for a second. The macro scale of David's reign is defined by thousands of fallen chariots, totally defeated armies, and conquered nations. But the micro scale of his reign, the true measure of his character, is perfectly captured by this quiet dinner table. A lame, terrified outcast, the grandson of his greatest enemy, is given a permanent seat of honor right next to the conqueror. Let's move to and see how this builds into the broader historical epilogue of the biblical text. Because this legacy of grace didn't just end with Mephibosheth. It laid a foundational ethos for the generations that followed, rippling out across centuries, all the way into the New Testament era. Centuries later, in the Acts of the Apostles, we see the Apostle Peter delivering this massive, foundational speech in Jerusalem. And right in the middle of it, he grounds his entire argument by referencing the patriarch David, saying he is both dead and buried and his sepulcher is with us unto this day. David wasn't just remembered as a guy who won a lot of wars. He was revered as a patriarch, a foundational pillar whose throne and legacy actually set the stage for the ultimate message of grace that the early church was about to unleash on the world. And we see David's communal table fellowship mirrored perfectly in the actions of that early church. The text in Acts describes a community practicing radical kindness. The believers were together, sharing all things in common. They sold their possessions and goods to part their wealth to anyone who had need, just like David providing an estate for a vulnerable outcast. And most beautifully, they broke bread from house to house with gladness. They made absolutely sure that no one lacked a seat at the table. So, the crucial point is this. When we look at the massive sweep of this history, from the blood-soaked battlefields of the ancient Near East all the way down to a quiet dining room in Jerusalem, we have to ask ourselves, is ultimate legacy built by the wars we win or the tables we set for our enemies? It's a profound thought to take away from the story of the conqueror who actively chose to become a caretaker. Thank you for exploring this explainer with me today, and as always, keep asking the big questions.